It is turning into quite the standoff. The COVID inquiry originally demanded the Cabinet Office hand over Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages by 4 this afternoon. When they claimed not to have them, the inquiry shot back, all right, you have until 4 on Thursday.
Government's handed over tens and tens of thousands of documents in a spirit of candour and transparency because it is important that we learn the lessons of COVID.
The threat of fines, or indeed jail, still stands if ministers in the Cabinet Office refuse to comply. So, what happens next? Also on News at 10. We do not support attacks on Russia. A tough line from the White House tonight after the drone strikes on Moscow. Trans rights activists disrupt a speech by a feminist speaker in Oxford this evening.
What I oppose is hateful and intolerant views. I oppose hell views. And I oppose the decision by the Oxford Union to amplify them.
The dramatic forest fires sweeping through Nova Scotia and a new vision on how to live with Alzheimer's.
Plus ils sont apaisés, plus ils ont les compétences habituelles et plus ils vivent sereinement leur maladie aussi.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. The standoff between the head of the COVID inquiry and the government over Boris Johnson's pandemic diaries and WhatsApp messages was supposed to end at 4 this afternoon. That was the deadline set by the retired judge for the Cabinet Office to hand over more of the former Prime Minister's notes. But tonight, things look to be shaping up for a legal fight, good and proper. The Cabinet Office originally refused to hand over all of them on the grounds that much of what was asked for was irrelevant. Now it says it can't get hold of them. The inquiry chair has set a new deadline, 4 p.m. Thursday. The threat of fines, or indeed jail for not meeting that deadline, remains in place.
Out running near his new home, Boris Johnson doesn't yet seem to have found where the T-shirts are kept. Of more consequence is whether he knows where his diaries and WhatsApp messages are. Last week, the government refused to give those to the COVID inquiry. Today, the government said they didn't actually have them. The Prime Minister insists they are being helpful.
Again, government's handed over tens and tens of thousands of documents in a spirit of candour and transparency because it is important that we learn the lessons of COVID. With regard to the particular question at the moment, we're carefully considering next steps, but the government is confident in its position.
That position is that they will not hand over material, including Boris Johnson's COVID-era messages, that lawyers have determined are unambiguously irrelevant to the inquiry, and which might deter open discussion within government in future. But the former head of the civil service says that shouldn't apply this time.
I do see the need for decisions to be made in a way that they can feel that not everything they say or decide gets out in the normal course of events. But this isn't the normal course of events. This is the COVID inquiry. And I think in these circumstances, they have to be completely transparent.
4 o'clock today was the deadline set by the COVID inquiry chair for the Johnson material to be handed over. The new deadline is now 4 o'clock on Thursday. The government has until then to tell the inquiry where it thinks all this material is and what it has done to get hold of it. That in itself could be interesting, as Team Johnson has let it be known they haven't been asked for this material by the government. Although there's an argument that some information on Boris Johnson's phone should have been archived when he left government.
I think there are serious questions to be asked about whether the information was treated properly and whether when Boris Johnson left and other ministers in his government left, whether they transferred the information that should have gone to the Cabinet Office.
Dr. Natalie McDermott still suffers from long COVID. She says the inquiry must be given everything.
The whole purpose of the inquiry is for us to understand how decisions were made and what we can learn for the future or for future pandemics. And if we don't have all of the articles that are involved in us making decisions, then how can we possibly learn from that for future pandemics?
The families of COVID victims say the same, and if the government wants to resist the order to hand over all the material the inquiry is demanding, it may have to go to court to do so.
Carl joins me now to talk about all this. I mean, this is rather an intriguing situation. What happens if the Cabinet Office does not meet Thursday's deadline?
Well, look, what could happen is that they could write to the inquiry on Thursday and say, Boris Johnson has got all his WhatsApps and his diaries and we don't have them, but we've asked him to ping them over and he says he'll do it later. And then the ball would be in Boris Johnson's court and they would have complied with the order. And it could be that they do something like that. But tonight, the Cabinet Office has doubled down on its argument that the inquiry does not have the power to request what it calls unambiguously irrelevant information. And that's because I think, although we're talking about Boris Johnson's WhatsApps this week, next week we could be talking about Rishi Sunak's or Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary's WhatsApps, or even future government ministers for future inquiries. And the government says that this sets a very harmful precedent for the normal operation of government business. And that is why it doesn't want to hand this stuff over. So although I'm sure both sides want to avoid a high court battle between the government and its own inquiry, with the government perhaps seeking a judicial review of the order to hand over this material, that is still very much the direction we're heading in.
OK, Carl. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the dangers of Western countries getting sucked into the fight for Ukraine's survival was illustrated today by America's reaction to early morning drone attacks on Moscow, upmarket areas of the city likely to be home to President Putin's cronies. The White House insisted we do not support attacks on Russia. Our Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, appeared to take a slightly different tack. He said Ukraine was entitled to project force, as he put it, outside its borders in self-defense. Ukraine said it wasn't them.
For a few fleeting seconds, the residents of one of Moscow's most upmarket suburbs got a glimpse of the fear felt every day in Kyiv. Captured from different angles on social media, this is one of what the Russian military say were 8 drones it shot down or jammed. On the ground, no serious injuries or damage, but it does shift the conflict onto Russia's streets. Its foreign ministry threatening to respond with the harshest possible measures. Its people, many of whom have been spared the reality of this war, unsettled, as their president seemed to acknowledge after blaming Ukraine.
It is a clear sign of terrorist activity. The Moscow air defense system worked satisfactorily. However, there is still work to be done to make it better.
It's only been a few weeks since the Kremlin was hit by a drone, with Russia blaming Ukraine. Kyiv rejects that and insists it wasn't involved in today's events either.
This could be anything from false flag operation to Russian groups acting inside Russia, to Russian military groups who have claimed responsibility for recent attacks on Russia. But what is clear is that Ukraine has nothing to do with this.
Independent conclusions on that are yet to be drawn, but what's beyond dispute is that all this pales in comparison to what Ukraine is enduring. Kyiv hit harder than usual, more frequently than usual, in attacks more widespread than usual over the past few days. For the British Foreign Secretary, speaking in Sweden, there was hypothetical support for retaliatory action, although with the firm proviso it would need to involve Russian military targets.
Ukraine does have the legitimate right to defend itself. It has the legitimate right to do so within its own borders, of course, but it does also have the right to project force beyond its borders to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself.
The White House repeating its more cautious stance.
As a general matter, we have said this before, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. We've been very clear about that.
But both sides know these are critical moments. Kyiv's suffering mounting again, along with fears that more attacks on Moscow might shift this war into new, dangerous territory. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
A scheme dreamt up by the government to ask supermarkets for a voluntary price freeze on basic food items has been given short shrift by one of the biggest names in the industry. Lord Rose, chairman of Asda, told us food inflation is going to stay high for a while yet and the government should leave shopkeeping to the shopkeepers.
I've been around in retail for a long time. We are a very efficient industry. Grocers are exceptionally good at what they do. I would warn any government of any complexion to be very, very careful about interfering with markets. Markets are funny things. They do what they want to do. And if once you start going and trying to interfere, you might get an unintended consequence. The government knows a lot about what it knows about, but it is not the shopkeeper. Leave shopkeeping to the shopkeepers and leave the politics to the politicians.
A talk for Oxford University students that trans rights protesters tried to ban this afternoon did go ahead. The guest speaker at the heart of it, a philosophy professor and avowed feminist, Kathleen Stock, said she didn't mind being interrupted. She was more worried about those institutions which have surrendered to protesters' views. The person doing the interrupting, by gluing themselves to the floor, said trans rights should not be up for debate.
Out of the closet! Into the streets!
They were demonstrating their right to be heard, even though their protest was against somebody else's right to speak. They formed up as ticket holders filed in to an event campaigners had tried to get cancelled because the main speaker has questioned trans rights, triggering the latest debate about freedom of speech on university campuses.
What is wrong with her standing up, expressing her views and being challenged on them?
What I oppose is hateful and intolerant views. I oppose hell views, and I oppose the decision by the Oxford Union to amplify them.
The speaker, Professor Kathleen Stock, was escorted inside by security guards. She's been accused of transphobia after saying males can't be women. She says she's standing up to those who want to silence debate. And while protesters couldn't stop the event, they did manage to disrupt it after one of them glued themselves to the floor.
This event has polarised students and academics here for weeks, with one group writing a letter saying that trans people should not have to debate their own existence. Another saying that hearing contentious views is an indispensable part of university.
The Prime Minister agreed today, tweeting, "A free society requires free debate. Dr. Stock's invitation to the Oxford Union should stand, and students should be allowed to hear and debate her views. We mustn't allow a small but vocal few to shut down discussion." This Oxford professor believes too many students simply aren't prepared to have their views challenged.
We need to tell students that actually hearing different voices is part of the essential part of being a student, essential part of being at a university, and if you don't like that, then you should probably not be, probably not right to be in this institution.
There are still women that don't get paid equally.
Tonight's protest certainly sparked a lively discussion.
I totally disagree with you. You know that trans women have been marginalised for centuries.
Campaigners here say trans rights are not up for debate. Others disagree. But the argument is increasingly about who should be allowed to speak and where. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Oxford.
The fall from grace of the ITV This Morning presenter, Philip Schofield, continued this evening. He was dropped by the Prince's Trust as an ambassador, and Ellie is here to talk about it. Ellie, what's happened this evening?
Well, Tom, we already know that Philip Schofield, who's been the face of children and then daytime telly for decades, had to leave ITV last week after he admitted that he'd lied about having an affair with a much younger male colleague. Tonight, we know that he's been dropped as an ambassador to the Prince's Trust, which is a charity founded by the King that helps young people get into jobs. I think we can see some footage now of Philip Schofield meeting King Charles. That's back in 2019. The charity has released a brief statement tonight. It says, "In light of Philip's recent admissions, we have agreed with him that it is no longer appropriate to work together." Now, this comes off the back of a weekend where Philip Schofield has been defending accusations from fellow former presenters of This Morning that it was a toxic workplace. Those include accusations from Eamon Holmes, who also accuses the broadcaster ITV of covering up that affair with a young man. ITV has told me tonight they've reiterated their statement that they investigated that relationship back in 2020, but, and I quote, did not find any evidence of a relationship beyond hearsay and rumour. Well, also tonight we have found out that ITV executives are going to face questions from MPs next week. I understand that this was already part of a scheduled appearance in front of the House of Commons Culture Committee, but I think we know now that they are going to face tougher questions next week about who knew what exactly when.
OK, Ellie, thank you very much indeed. Now, the Metropolitan Police has itself admitted it is facing more difficult questions about the behaviour of its officers, this time over the treatment of a 90-year-old woman. She didn't just have a taser pointed at her by officers called to her home in Peckham in South London. She had a mesh hood placed over her head after officers said she spat at one of them. She was handcuffed as well. Neighbours have told us she had dementia and was often confused. One officer has already been suspended. Another 5 are on restricted duties, kept away from the public. The Independent Office for Police Conduct is now investigating. The anger felt around the world at the decision of Uganda's President Museveni to promote the death penalty for gay sex, yes, you did hear that right, has been exemplified by President Biden. He has issued a not-so-veiled threat of international reprisals, saying the new law jeopardises critical economic growth in Uganda, possible sanctions, in other words.
Sula hasn't been home for 7 years. He's been living on the outskirts of Kenya's capital, Nairobi, where he stays in a safe house. Because in Uganda, where he grew up, his sexuality makes him anything but safe.
I was beaten. I remember waking up the next day when I was covered in plasters. You know, the whole experience of, being a gay person in Uganda, it's very brutal, and you always have to look on your shoulder, know where to go and where to not go. So it's literally, you're made into an alien within your own country.
And that was before the introduction of Uganda's new anti-homosexuality bill. The bill, signed into law yesterday, is one of the harshest in the world.
And what is the punishment? The maximum punishment is death.
It has been met with global condemnation. President Joe Biden described it as shameful and said the US would be considering sanctions. The bill imposes the death sentence for the offence of aggravated homosexuality, which includes transmitting HIV through gay sex. Promoting homosexuality carries a jail sentence, and children convicted of same-sex offences can also be sent to prison. Human rights groups have joined the UN in warning that the bill puts progress against HIV and AIDS in jeopardy.
Persons who identify as sexual minorities who do not get the services, especially treatment that they require, then we are saying that we are not really considering fighting HIV and AIDS and other conditions fully.
Back at the Kenyan safe house, if 28-year-old Chris ever dreamed of going home, he doesn't anymore.
I can't even imagine going back to Uganda, because it will be my death. It will be like putting yourself on fire. It will be like putting yourself in den of lions, like killing yourself, saying, I can't.
There are those who have already been forced to leave their lives behind. And now there is a new law which threatens to destroy so many more. Chloe Keedy, News at 10.
To eastern Canada now, where forest fires in Nova Scotia are forcing the evacuation of thousands of people in and around the city of Halifax. Dozens of homes have already gone up in flames. The fires have broken out earlier in the year than normal. Climate change is being blamed. They have been burning since Sunday. Smoke has been drifting south along the Atlantic coast of the United States.
That's fire.
It's not even high summer yet in Canada, but once again the country is contending with ferocious wildfires. This road in Nova Scotia showed how fast the wall of flames can suddenly engulf those trying to get out. The driver almost hitting another car as visibility was reduced to practically zero.
Go.
Fire brigades are struggling to contain 213 blazes across a vast swathe of wilderness. 81 are out of control. In many places, the fires have roared into towns, engulfing homes with little warning. The reason it's so bad? Dramatic shifts in the climate, which have melted snow faster and left forests tinder dry.
The temperature and the wind combined with the lack of precipitation this year really created this mix that created the extreme fire risk that we entered a fire ban a week before this fire broke out in the county.
This is Halifax on the normally cool Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, now facing fires within the city limits. Climate scientist and local Jim Abraham is attending a conference posing one central question.
How do we prepare Canadians for events that they've never seen before? And that's the situation we're dealing with. My hometown, Halifax, Nova Scotia, is dealing with a wildfire, unprecedented wildfire right now.
3,000 miles away in Alberta, the fires have been largely tamed, but continue to smoulder.
It could last a long time, weeks if not months. The fire officer was just telling me that they had similar, because of the peaty soil, they had a similar fire that took over a year.
Probably not even worth it. That's going to jump over that grass like nothing.
Those still facing the full brunt of this disaster are doing what they can to hold back the flames. But the fire season here has barely begun, and it's already looking like Canada will be contending with the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. Dan Rivers, News at 10.
Members of a gang which sold access to illegally streamed Premier League matches have been sent to jail. They hacked the accounts of genuine paid-up customers to offer cut-price deals to more than 50,000 people. The operation made them more than £7 million in 5 years. The 5 men were convicted of plotting to defraud and money laundering. The science is pretty clear that for habitual smokers, switching to vapes reduces the risk to their health. So far, so good. What definitely isn't good, though, is the number of children getting hooked on them. The government now says vapes should not be targeted at the under-18s. It wants to close a legal loophole that allows shops to give free sample to children in England. Ministers are also considering a ban on retailers selling nicotine-free vapes. Finding a way to help people with Alzheimer's disease live the best lives they can is a challenge that is only going to get bigger as the number of patients grows. In a special village in southwest France, they have come up with a revolutionary approach. It is, in essence, a nursing home that looks like the outside world and is funded by local government, a combination of protection and independence, by allowing the residents, aged from 40 to 102, to keep busy, worry less and do their own thing. The advance of dementia seems to be slower.
This is Village Landais. It is a place full of life. But behind these smiles is sadness. Everyone living here has Alzheimer's.
Encore une fois. Oh, voilà.
Christiane is one of 120 residents and enjoys a new freedom here. She shops in the village supermarket where there are no checkouts. Remembering to pay can be stressful, and so that pressure is taken away.
Tu fais la visite?
And in her shared apartment, Christiane's room is just like home.
C'est bon. Ça, c'est des souvenirs, des photos de mon papa, de moi, de ma fille.
This whole village is an experiment to see if improving quality of life can slow disease progression. The psychologist here wants people to feel the freedom. She holds sessions inside this carriage they call the train to anywhere.
Plus ils sont apaisés, plus ils ont les compétences habituelles et plus ils vivent sereinement leur maladie aussi.
But serenity doesn't always come easy. Janine spent her working life caring for those with dementia. Then she was diagnosed with the disease. It took time to accept.
You say your mum is happier, more relaxed. Why do you think that is?
On est beaucoup moins stressé. À la maison, c'était tout le temps non, ah non, on fait pas ça, non, tu vas pas aller là, non, tu fais pas. Ouais, mais oui. Et en fait, on lui transmettait notre stress, on lui transmettait un peu tout et.
But all of this comes at a price. It costs €7 million a year to run, and fees are almost 30% higher than in conventional nursing homes.
And it's those costs that cast doubt over whether something like this is a long-term option. Is it economically viable? Perhaps it comes down to how much we care.
And for researchers, it is very much about well-being. Academics at Bordeaux University meet with villagers every 6 months to monitor their symptoms.
There is an improvement, not only in the brain, but also in the behavior. It is most costly, but if it is associated with a clear, better quality of life of villagers, what do we want?
There is no escaping the cruelty of this disease, but as best they can, people here are not just existing, they are living. Rachel Townsend, News at 10, Southern France.
And there is more on Rachel's report in On Assignment with Raggy coming up straight after the news and the news from your area. Members of the Royal Navy who took part in the Queen's funeral procession through London last September were presented with medals by King Charles today by way of a thank you. Among them was a heavily pregnant medical assistant, Paisley Chambers-Smith. She was one of nearly 100 sailors who pulled the gun carriage carrying the Queen's coffin. She wore a summer dress for the occasion. There is as yet no such thing as a Royal Navy ceremonial maternity uniform. Now, we are going to end tonight's News at 10 by remembering one of the bright, shining lights of our business. As you might have seen or read over the weekend, our health and science editor, the brilliant and brave Emily Morgan, has incredibly sadly died after a short illness. It has left all of us shocked, and of course her family, of whom she was so openly proud, devastated. Since her death on Friday, there have been thousands of messages of support for them and admiration of Emily, including from past and present health secretaries. One of the many ITV viewers who wrote about her said, "When she spoke, I listened. So indeed did we, often, when she was sitting right here in the studio." I had the joy of knowing Emily for half her 45 years. Like many others here, I was so incredibly proud to call her a friend. And she was such a great one. Loyal, kind, thoughtful, decent. None of us can believe, truthfully, we probably don't want to believe, that she has indeed gone. Good night, and thank you very much indeed for watching.
And to you, Amanda,
she will be familiar to many, if not all of you.
This has been a bit of a miracle for you, hasn't it?
As our health editor, Emily Morgan became a household name during the dark days of the pandemic.
Unsurprisingly, every single bed in this ICU ward is taken up with a patient.
If the sheer volume of time spent on COVID wards exposed her to a degree of risk, she was always clear as to why she was doing it.
That was the reason we went in. We had a duty to do that as journalists, to report firsthand on the ground.
Over more than a decade, her reporting on health and politics and much else besides was marked out by its clarity, its style, charisma, compassion and basic humanity.
Are you going to be okay?
Yes. Just soldier on. Stiff up and...
Has there been a moment where you've woken up in the morning and thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? The last few days have been a disaster.
She actually began her career as a producer, working behind the scenes. For 5 years at Westminster, we worked together every day as we crisscrossed the globe on planes and trains and automobiles after Blair and Brown and Cameron and many others besides. She was brilliant at her job, it's true, but she was also incredibly funny and completely irreverent. I once persuaded our editor to send us across Canada by train with cameraman Rob Turner to make a film on how the Canadians cut the deficit. Emily referred to this ever afterwards in front of the senior management as our holiday in Canada with Rob. Like many a friendship born at work, it was full of the talk of the joys of home. We watched her fall in love, get married, have 2 wonderful daughters. She must have had her faults. We all do, but we didn't see them. In the 33 years I've been here, I'm not sure I've witnessed too many people more popular in this newsroom. We are devastated tonight, because we really loved her. And if you'd known her, you would have too.